Hello, this is John Spink. I'm Director and Assistant Professor of the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University, and this is our Food Fraud Initiative Video Encyclopedia. Chapter 16 covers article overviews, and this is Module 2, which covers our article Introducing the Food Fraud Initial Screening Model. This is actually Part 2 of 2, which provides a little bit more background on the initial screening and the GFSI requirements. Specifically, we're going to look at GFSI Issue 7 compliance. This is the new GFSI requirements. First off, to give a little background on GFSI. So originally GFSI was created because there were a lot of different regulations around the world. Many were very similar, but not exactly the same. And so compliance with one or process for one might not necessarily equate to compliance for another. So GFSI was formed to provide an overarching, broad type of program so that hopefully implementing one program would support many of those regulations. So the process began with regulations. First off, GFSI identifies the idea. They do not write standards or implement them. They just create the general scope. Second are scheme owners, or these food safety management schemes. They are the standard, and there's many companies that develop many types of standards. Some focus on different parts of different industries. And then companies themselves, they implement and execute these food safety management systems. They do it. Finally, our certification via third-party audits. This is where the adherence to the standard and the idea are confirmed. If a government requires a process to address food fraud, for example, the Food Safety Modernization Act requires a vulnerability assessment for food fraud, and then requires a mitigation plan where appropriate. The government requires a process. They don't define which process, and they don't endorse any process. But the government probably realizes that there are processes in place. So if the government requires a process, that completes the cycle, which leads to stronger regulations and basically increasing the safety of the supply chain. GFSI food fraud scope overall. Now, Issue 7 is supposed to be very short and tight in the amount of content. It's not a background document. So to get more information on food fraud is to take one step back and look at GFSI's official position paper. This was published by GFSI's Board of Directors under guidance from the Food Fraud Think Tank, and we at Michigan State were one of 6 members on that Food Fraud Think Tank. So this is where we really see the scope and the intent of GFSI. They created this position paper long before Issue 7 was released to specifically give this direction. So food fraud, including a subcategory of economically motivated adulteration, is of growing concern. Food fraud is deception of consumers using food products, ingredients, and packaging for economic gain, and includes substitution, unapproved enhancements, misbranding, counterfeiting stolen goods, or others. Couple key points. It includes food products, ingredients, and packaging. That's ingredients, incoming goods, and that's packaging, finished goods. Second is it's not only adulterant substances, it includes counterfeiting, stolen goods, or others as well. Stolen goods are an item that there is no adulterant substance in there. More broadly, and as you can see from the citations many years ago, GFSI and the think tank did define many of these type of issues, all the way down to gray market theft and diversion. Two others that are in there as well are production overruns and tampering. Anytime the product's outside of the control, there could be fraud. And traditionally, economically motivated adulteration, as defined by the previous Federal Register notices for US FDA, defined as really only as adulterant substances. But FSMA then looks more broadly and preventive controls to define any type of agent that could be economically motivated that creates a hazard. For example, stolen goods, that act of stealing the goods is economically motivated, and if that product is left to spoil or mishandled and it spoils, then the agent would be that spoilage agent. The fraudsters did not intentionally put the spoilage agent in, but the original hazard, or the hazard resulting, came from the original economically motivated act of stealing the product. This broad definition of food fraud and scope is consistent with the United Kingdom, the EU, GFSI, China, FDA, ISO, and others. Food Fraud Think Tank. GFSI specifically identified 3 different types of vulnerability assessments. That for hazards is food safety, or for food safety is HACCP. For food defense is TACCP, a threat assessment in in the US FDA terms, that would have been Carver Shock, or now the FDA Plan Builder. And then a third and separate type of vulnerability. And this is a reason why GFSI endorsed the SSAFE guidance on a separate food fraud vulnerability assessment to really define explicitly and provide initial guidance and feedback on what that type of assessment may look like. Big question is things like horse meat. Where would horse meat fit in? Horse meat is definitely a priority for food companies and governments, but there's no public health threat. So if you conducted a HACCP or a TACCP type threat assessment, that horse meat and addressing it would be a very low priority. That's a reason, an example why this vulnerability assessment, VASP, or food fraud vulnerability assessment is so important. To look specifically at what's required by GFSI, and this is about the extent of issue 7, is just really requiring a food fraud vulnerability assessment and a food fraud vulnerability control plan. There's not much more information or guidance than this. Standard certifications and audits. So one example is to look at BRC. So BRC is one of those scheme owners that creates a standard, and they have issued an update called issue 7, which relates to GFSI issue 7, and looking at these vulnerability assessments. And as you can see, they have very specific requirements for dealing with either authenticity or fraud, which is all types of food fraud. And the key here with BRC is written for BRC compliance, but BRC compliance is correlated with GFSI overall. So these should be considered with the GFSI issue 7 as well as with GFSI's position paper on food fraud. Then the initial assessment flowchart. So GFSI has endorsed the work by SSAFE, which is another food association, to develop a food fraud vulnerability assessment, and they did develop that. And then SSAFE has worked with PwC to operationalize this and make the product more available and automated in an online tool on their website. And in there they have a initial assessment, which talks about areas of possible focus. So this is a flow chart to help figure where you start and how you go. One thing that we'll point out is this very last one in the bottom right is where there could be this company-wide basis review. So complete as a minimum FFVA on a company-wide basis. This is where the food fraud initial screening really fits in, and this is where there's that natural transition from stage 1 ERM risk assessment into stage 2, the more detailed. So things like this flow chart will help figure and define how deep you need to go. FFIS, it can be used at the beginning here as well for scoping, just to get that broad insight. For example, where appropriate given the scale of your company, well, how do we define what's appropriate? The food fraud initial screening provides a method to consider things like that. And the food fraud initial screening is also here at the very end. Thank you. For more information or questions, please contact me.